the morning I saw what I saw. I'd already been on the road for 6 hours. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what my life looked like before, or none of this will make sense. You need to know who I was when I still believed the world worked the way we're told it works. My name is Cyrus Valewood. I've driven trucks for Consolidated Freight out of Zanesville, Ohio for 11 years now. Or I did, before I took the transfer. Hauling auto parts mostly, sometimes lumber, occasionally machinery that cost more than my trailer. Southeastern Ohio isn't glamorous work, but it's steady. The roads wind through hills that look like green waves frozen mid-crash, and if you've got the right temperament for solitude, it's not a bad way to make a living. I lived alone in a double wide at the mouth of Black Snake Hollow, about 20 minutes from the nearest anything you'd call a town. My grandmother raised me there. After my parents split when I was 7, Dad went to Michigan. Mom went to Pieces, and Grandma Ruth took me in, without a word of complaint. She passed in 2019, left me the trailer and 2 acres of scrubby land backed up against state forest. I'd kept the place partly out of sentiment, partly because the rent was nothing and the quiet suited me. My routine was simple enough that I could run it on autopilot. Up at 4 a.m., coffee from the pot I'd prepped the night before out the door by 4:30. I'd gas up at the pilot station on the edge of Zanesville, shoot the breeze with whoever was working the counter, usually Maria, a grandmother herself who called everyone honey, and made the best truck stop breakfast burritos in the Tri-County area. Then I'd climb into my rig, a blue Peterbilt 579 that Consolidated kept in decent shape, and I'd drive. I knew every curve of Route 78 like I knew my own hands, knew where the deer liked to cross near mile marker 23, knew the pothole outside Caldwell that the county had been promising to fix for 3 years, knew which bridges iced up first in winter and which straightaways invited you to push the speed limit if you were feeling bold. The road was more home to me than the trailer, if I'm being honest. Sundays I'd call my sister Denise in Columbus. She'd gotten out of the hollow as soon as she could. Scholarship to Ohio State. Married a guy who did something with computers. 2 kids now who called me Uncle Si and asked why I never came to visit. I always said I would, next month when work slowed down. Work never slowed down, and I never visited. That's just how things were. I had a dog too. Beaumont, a red-bone coonhound I'd gotten from a guy at the truck stop whose bitch had thrown a litter. Beaumont was lazy in that good way hounds are, content to sleep on the porch all day and bay at the moon when the mood struck him. He'd been with me 5 years by then, and I figured he'd be with me another 5 at least. That was my life. Nothing special, nothing complicated. Just a man, a dog, a trailer, and the road. I thought I knew everything there was to know about Black Snake Hollow and the hills around it. I'd grown up in those woods, hunting with my grandfather before he passed, fishing the creek that ran behind the property. I'd spent 37 years learning every shadow those trees could throw. I didn't know anything. The first thing I noticed was the deer. It was late October, 3 weeks before the sighting, and the deer should have been everywhere. Rut season, when the bucks get stupid with hormones and the does cluster together in nervous groups. I'd hit 2 deer in my career, both during October, both at dusk when they bolted across the road without warning. I knew to watch for them this time of year, but there was nothing to watch for. I'd drive to work in the dark, headlights cutting through the fog that pooled in the low places, and the roadside was empty. No deer. Not reduced. Gone. I mentioned it to Maria one morning, half joking, asking if someone had come through and cleared them all out. "Probably the coyotes," she said, sliding my burrito across the counter. "They've been thick this year." But the coyotes had gone quiet, too. I realized it that first weekend, sitting on my porch with a beer while the sun bled out over the hills. There should have been yipping, that eerie chorus that rises up after dark and makes you feel small in the right kind of way. Instead, there was nothing, just silence so thick it felt like pressure against my eardrums. The owls had stopped calling, too. I didn't notice at first. You don't notice the absence of something until the absence becomes a presence, if that makes any sense. But by the second week, it was undeniable. The woods behind my property had gone mute. No owls, no coyotes, no deer crashing through the underbrush. Even the frogs in the creek had quieted. Then there was Beaumont. That dog had slept on the porch every night since I'd brought him home as a pup. I'd built him a house out there, insulated it, even wired in a heating pad for winter. He loved that porch. But one evening I came home from a run to Columbus and found him huddled under the trailer, wedged into the narrow crawl space where the skirting had come loose. "The hell are you doing under there, boy?" He whined, that high, thin sound dogs make when they're scared, and refused to come out. I had to coax him with jerky, and even then he low-crawled out like he expected something to grab him from behind. That night, he slept inside for the first time since he was a puppy. I told myself he must have seen a snake under there, spooked himself good. But he didn't go back to the porch. Not that night. Not any night after. He'd stand at the door at dusk, staring out through the screen, and his hackles would rise along his spine in a ridge I could see from across the room. Sometimes he'd growl, this low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. I'd go to the door, flip on the porch light, see nothing but the yard and the tree line beyond. "What is it, Beau? What's out there?" He never answered, of course. He just kept staring at the trees until I pulled him away. The dogs at the neighboring properties started acting the same way. Dale Murphy lived a quarter-mile down the road, had 3 mutts he kept for no particular reason other than company. I stopped by one afternoon to borrow his chainsaw, and he mentioned that his dogs had stopped going past the fence line. "Won't even chase squirrels no more," he said, shaking his head. "Just sit on the porch and growl at the trees. You'd think there was a bear out there." "You seen any bear sign?" "Not a track, not a scat pile, nothing." I didn't tell him about Beaumont. I didn't tell him about the silence either, or the missing deer. It felt silly to say out loud, like I was working myself up over nothing. So I took the chainsaw and went home and didn't think about it too hard. But I bought a trail camera, one of those motion-activated units hunters use to scout deer. I set it up at the tree line behind my property, aimed at the gap in the brush where animals usually emerge to drink from the creek. If there was a bear out there, or a cougar, that was my theory at the time, that a big cat had moved into the area pushed east by development and was spooking everything smaller than itself, the camera would catch it. The first night, the camera triggered 14 times. I checked it the next morning, scrolling through images on the tiny screen, frame after frame of empty woods, the brush, the trees, the creek glinting in the infrared flash. Nothing else, no animal, no movement that I could see. Just the same scene, repeated 14 times between midnight and 4 a.m. I checked the motion sensor. It was working fine. I repositioned the camera, aimed it lower, thinking maybe a raccoon or possum was triggering it from the ground. The next night, it triggered 22 times. Same result. Empty frames. Just trees and darkness and that creek running silent in the distance. My sister called that Sunday, and she must have heard something in my voice because she asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just tired, working too much. She said I was spending too much time alone out there in the hollow, that I should come to Columbus, meet her husband's sister who was recently divorced and looking. I'm not looking for company, I said. Everyone needs company, Si, even you. I didn't tell her what I was really thinking, which was that I had company out there. I just didn't know what kind. The thing about living alone is that you start to trust your instincts more than you trust other people's explanations. Dale said bears. Maria said coyotes. My sister said I was lonely and imagining things, but none of them were waking up at 3 a.m. with their heart pounding, certain that something was standing just beyond the tree line, watching the trailer. None of them heard what I heard the night before the sighting. It was 2 a.m., give or take. Beaumont was sleeping at the foot of my bed, which was his new habit, and he came awake all at once, the way dogs do when they smell trouble. His head lifted, his ears swiveled, and then he growled, not at the door, not at the window, but at the wall that faced the woods. I lay there in the dark, not moving, barely breathing, and I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from the direction of the tree line. But they weren't the 4-beat rhythm of a deer or a dog. They were slower, heavier, 2 feet. Something walking upright. The footsteps stopped about 20 yards from the trailer. Beaumont's growl cut off like someone had flipped a switch, and he pressed himself against my legs so hard I could feel him trembling. We lay there, the dog and I, for what felt like an hour but was probably 5 minutes. The silence outside was absolute. No insects, no frogs, no wind in the trees. Just that thick, pressing quiet that I'd come to associate with wrongness. Then, from somewhere in the dark, I heard breathing. Low and deep, with a slight rasp at the end of each exhale. It was coming from the direction of my bedroom window, which was open a crack to let in the cool night air. I didn't move. I didn't look. Some instinct older than language told me that if I looked, if I acknowledged what was out there, something terrible would happen. So I lay still and I kept my eyes on the ceiling and I listened to that breathing until finally it stopped. The footsteps retreated. 2 legs walking slow, in no hurry at all. They faded into the trees, and Beaumont let out a long, shuddering breath, and the insects started up again, like they'd been waiting for permission. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that it was a bear, that bears don't walk on 2 legs, but maybe this one had been injured, was moving awkwardly, that the breathing had been the wind through the screen, even though there was no wind. I almost believed it. I wanted to believe it so badly that I could taste the lie on the back of my tongue. But when I went outside at dawn to check the ground beneath my window, I found the prints. 5 toes, just like a man, but too big, nearly twice the length of my own boot, pressed 3 inches into the soft earth. And at the end of each toe, where a man would have a nail, there were gouges in the dirt. Long curved gouges, like something had been kneading the ground with claws. I spent the next hour on my hands and knees in the dirt, measuring those prints with a tape measure I dug out of my toolbox. 11 inches long, 5.5 inches wide at the ball. The stride between them was just over 4 feet, which meant whatever had made them was tall, taller than me, and I stood 6'1" in my work boots. The claw marks at the end of each toe dug nearly 2 inches into the packed earth, and when I pressed my thumb into one of them, I could feel the smooth groove where something sharp had dragged through the soil. I took pictures with my phone, 12 of them from every angle in the gray morning light that filtered through the trees. Then I went inside and looked up bear tracks on my laptop, scrolling through image after image, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was normal, natural, explainable. Bear tracks have 5 toes, so did these. Bear tracks show claw marks, so did these. But bear tracks are wider than they are long, with the toes arranged in a curve. These were narrow, elongated, with the toes pointing straight forward like a human foot. And bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended distances. They rear up to look around, to intimidate. But they don't stroll through the woods at 2 a.m., pausing outside bedroom windows to breathe. I called in sick that day. First time in 3 years. My supervisor, a guy named Patterson, who'd never liked me much, made a noise like he didn't believe me, but he approved the absence without argument. I spent the morning driving around the hollow, stopping at the places where I'd always seen deer, looking for any sign of what might have scared them off. Nothing. The woods were empty in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had come through and swept them clean. I found a few old deer beds, the grass pressed flat in ovals where they'd slept, but they were weeks old. Whatever had been using them had moved on long ago. At the pilot station, I tried to bring it up casually with Maria. I ordered my usual burrito and coffee, and while she was wrapping it up, I asked if anyone else had mentioned anything strange in the area. Strange how, honey? I don't know. Animals acting weird, dogs spooked, that kind of thing. She shrugged, sliding my food across the counter. It's almost November. Animals always get weird before winter. They can feel it coming, you know? They're smarter than us that way. I wanted to tell her about the prints, about the breathing, about the way Beaumont had pressed himself against my legs, like he was trying to crawl inside my skin. But I didn't. I just nodded and paid and went back to my truck, and I sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the photos on my phone. A state trooper pulled in while I was sitting there, a young guy. Couldn't have been more than 25, with the kind of fresh-faced earnestness that said he still believed in the system. I thought about flagging him down, showing him the pictures, asking if anyone had reported anything unusual on Route 78. But what would I say? That something had walked up to my trailer in the middle of the night and breathed outside my window. That it left footprints like a man, but claws like a bear. He'd think I was crazy. He'd probably want to smell my breath, check my pupils for dilation, ask how much I'd had to drink the night before. So I let him go inside for his coffee, and I drove home. And I spent the rest of the day sitting on my porch with my grandfather's shotgun across my knees. The gun made me feel better, even though I knew it probably shouldn't. It was a Remington 870 12 gauge with a walnut stock that my grandfather had oiled every Sunday after church. I'd killed my first deer with that gun when I was 14. Dropped it clean at 60 yards, right through the heart. I knew what the shotgun could do to flesh and bone, but I also knew, in some quiet part of my mind, that I didn't want to examine too closely, that whatever had left those prints wasn't a deer, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I'd ever learned to hunt. Beaumont wouldn't come outside. He stood at the screen door and whined, but every time I tried to coax him onto the porch, He backed away with his tail between his legs. Eventually, I gave up and let him stay inside. And I sat there alone as the sun tracked across the sky and the shadows stretched longer and the trees at the edge of my property began to blur into a wall of darkness. I kept watching that tree line, waiting for something to move, waiting for something to explain what I'd seen. Nothing came. Dale stopped by around 4 p.m., his truck rattling up the gravel drive with a rack of firewood in the bed. He'd been cutting deadfall on his property and had more than he needed. Figured I could use some for winter. We stacked it together in silence, the way men do when they're both thinking about something else. And finally he straightened up and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You look like hell, Si. Didn't sleep much last night? Dogs keep you up." I hesitated. Dale was the closest thing I had to a friend out here. We weren't close exactly, but we'd known each other since I was a kid, and he'd helped my grandmother with the heavier work around the property when she got too old to manage it herself. If anyone would believe me, it would be him. "Something was outside my trailer last night," I said. "Walked right up to my bedroom window." Dale's face didn't change. "What kind of something?" "I don't know. Big, 2 legs, left prints in the dirt." "You see it?" "No, just heard it breathing." He was quiet for a long moment, stacking another log on the pile. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured, like he was choosing his words from a very short list. "There's things in these woods, Si, things that don't have names. My daddy used to talk about them, said his daddy talked about them too. They don't bother folks usually, keep to themselves. But every now and then, something stirs them up and they come down out of the deep hollows to take a look around." "What kind of things?" He shrugged, but it wasn't casual. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Nobody knows. Nobody wants to know. The smart ones just keep their heads down and wait for it to pass." "Wait for what to pass?" Dale looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that might have been fear. Then he shook his head and climbed back into his truck. "Just keep your dog inside at night," he said through the window. "And don't go looking for trouble. Trouble in these hollows has a way of looking back." He drove away before I could ask any more questions, and I stood there with the firewood stacked around me, feeling more alone than I had in years. That night I kept every light in the trailer on. Beaumont stayed pressed against my legs, and I didn't try to make him move. We sat on the couch together watching nothing on the television, and I kept the shotgun within arm's reach. Around 11 p.m., I heard the footsteps again. They came from the direction of the tree line, slow and steady, that same 2-beat rhythm I'd heard the night before. Beaumont's head came up. His ears swiveled. But this time he didn't growl. He just trembled, silent, his whole body vibrating against mine like a plucked string. The footsteps circled the trailer. I tracked them by sound alone, keeping my eyes fixed on the wall in front of me, refusing to look at the windows. They moved around the back, past the bedroom, along the side where I kept the propane tanks, and then they stopped at the front porch. The boards creaked. Something heavy was standing just outside the door. I raised the shotgun. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the barrel steady. Beaumont had stopped trembling. He was rigid now, frozen, like a rabbit hoping the hawk would pass him by. Nothing happened. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, and I could feel sweat running down my spine even though the trailer was cold. The propane heat had kicked off an hour ago, and I hadn't bothered to restart it. Then the porch light flickered. I'd left it on deliberately. 100-watt bulb in a fixture my grandmother had installed 30 years ago. It had never flickered before. Not once in all the years I'd lived there, but now it sputtered, dimmed, and for one terrible moment went completely dark. In that moment of darkness, I saw the eyes. They were visible through the small window set into the front door, a window I'd looked through 1,000 times without thinking twice about it. 2 points of light, amber gold, positioned at least 7 feet off the ground. They caught what little moonlight filtered through the trees and threw it back at me, and they were wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, wrong in the shape of the pupils, wrong in the way they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The light came back on, the eyes were gone, but I knew they'd been there. I hadn't imagined them. They'd been real, and they'd been watching me, and whatever they belonged to was standing on my porch. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat on the couch with the shotgun until dawn leaked through the windows, and then I went outside and found nothing. No prints, no marks on the porch, no sign that anything had been there at all. But the motion sensor on my trail camera had triggered 43 times. The next 2 days passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I went to work because I didn't know what else to do, driving my routes on autopilot, while my mind churned through explanations that didn't explain anything. I stopped at the pilot station. I talked to Maria. I pretended everything was normal while my hands shook and my eyes darted to every shadow, every dark place between the trees. I told myself it was a bear with some kind of eye disease that made its pupils reflect light wrong, a bear that had learned to walk upright because of an injury maybe, or some genetic quirk. Bears could be smart. Bears could be curious. There was no reason to think it was anything else. But I didn't believe it, not really. Not when I remembered how those eyes had blinked sideways like a dog's. Not when I remembered the breathing, low and raspy, with that edge of something almost like amusement. On the third day, I saw the silhouette. I was driving home from a short run to Caldwell, hauling a load of lumber that needed to be at the yard by morning. It was late afternoon, maybe 5:30, with the sun already sinking behind the hills and the shadows stretching long across the road. The light had that golden quality it gets in autumn, when everything looks painted and unreal. I was coming around a curve near mile marker 27, 3 miles from the turnoff to Blacksnake Hollow, when something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned my head just for a second and I saw it. It was standing at the tree line on the north side of the road, silhouetted against the sky where the hill dropped away into the next hollow. Just a shape, a figure too tall and too broad to be a man. Its head was wrong, elongated with what might have been ears rising from the top like triangles against the fading light. Its shoulders were massive, sloping down into arms that hung past where a man's arms would end. And it was watching me. I couldn't see its eyes from that distance, but I knew the same way you know when someone's staring at the back of your head in a crowded room. Its attention was on me, on my truck, tracking my progress along the curve with the patient focus of a predator. My foot came off the gas. The truck slowed, and for one insane moment I thought about stopping, getting out, walking across the road to get a better look. The shape didn't move. It just stood there, impossibly still, waiting. Then something in my hindbrain screamed at me, a voice without words, a terror without logic, and my foot slammed back down on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring, and I took that curve faster than I should have, faster than was safe. In the mirror, the shape was gone. I pulled over 2 miles down the road, hands locked on the wheel, heart hammering against my ribs. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, and I could feel the sweat soaking through my shirt even though the cab was cold. 8 feet tall, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. And the way it had stood there so still, so patient, like it knew I was coming. Like it had been waiting. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, and then I drove the rest of the way home with every light on the truck blazing and the radio turned up loud enough to drown out my thoughts. That night, I didn't wait for it to come to me. I loaded the shotgun with slugs. Not birdshot, not buckshot, but solid lead slugs meant for dropping deer at range. And I sat on the porch with Beaumont whimpering behind the screen door. "What are you?" I said to the dark. "What do you want?" The woods didn't answer. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, and I sat there until my coffee went cold and my bones ached from the chill. Nothing came. Nothing made a sound. But I could feel it out there somewhere in the darkness between the trees, watching, waiting. I told myself it wasn't real. I told myself I was exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that I'd been alone out here too long and was starting to crack. I told myself that tomorrow I'd drive into Zanesville and see a doctor, get something to help me sleep, something to quiet the fear that had taken root in my chest and wouldn't let go. I told myself a lot of things that night. I didn't believe any of them. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I'd doze off for a few minutes at a time, chin dropping to my chest, and then jerk awake with my heart slamming against my ribs and my fingers white-knuckled around the shotgun's stock. The porch light cast its weak yellow circle across the yard, and beyond that circle was nothing but darkness and the shapes of trees I'd known my whole life, now transformed into something alien and threatening. Around 3 a.m, Beaumont stopped whimpering. He'd been keeping up a steady low sound from behind the screen door, that anxious dog noise that sits halfway between a whine and a growl. But at 3, he went silent. I turned to look at him through the screen, and he was pressed flat against the floor, his belly to the linoleum, his eyes fixed on something past me, past the porch, out in the darkness beyond the reach of the light. I turned back around slowly, my shoulder blades tightening, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to look, but knowing I had to. At first I didn't see anything. Just the yard, the tree line, the shadows pooling between the oaks like standing water. Then something shifted, a movement so slight I almost missed it. About 40 yards out, where the old logging trail cut between 2 massive tulip poplars. A shape separating itself from the darker shadows, stepping forward just far enough that the edge of the porch light touched it. I saw the snout first, long and tapered like a German shepherd's, but stretched out wrong, too narrow at the tip and too deep through the jaw. The lips were pulled back, not in a snarl, but in something that might have been a smile, and I could see teeth. God help me, I could see teeth that gleamed wet and yellow in that pitiful 40-watt glow. They weren't dog teeth, not exactly. Too many of them, for one thing, crowded together in that long jaw like a shark's mouth. And the canines were curved backward like fish hooks, made for gripping and holding and not letting go. The fur was gray-brown, the color of dead leaves in November. Thick and coarse-looking where it caught the light. It stood upright like a man, shoulders hunched forward, and I could see the rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. Slow, steady breaths. Calm breaths. the breaths of something that wasn't afraid of anything in these woods. Then it raised one hand, not a paw, a hand, with fingers that were too long and joints that bent in too many places, and it pressed that hand against the trunk of the nearest tree. Just held it there, palm flat against the bark, those impossible fingers splayed out like a man bracing himself. The claws at the tip of each finger were black and curved, and they dug into the wood like it was soft cheese. I raised the shotgun. My hands were shaking so badly the barrel wavered, drawing little circles in the air, but I got it up to my shoulder, and I thumbed off the safety, and I sighted down that long, dark shape at the edge of my yard. 40 yards. I'd killed deer at 60 yards with this gun. I'd killed my first buck at 14 with my grandfather's hands guiding mine, and I'd never missed a shot that mattered. At 40 yards, with a slug, I couldn't miss. The creature tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, like a dog hearing a strange sound. Its ears, those tall triangular ears I'd seen silhouetted against the sky, swiveled toward me, and I could see them moving independently, tracking different sounds the way a horse's ears will. Then its eyes caught the light. They were yellow. Not amber, not gold, but yellow like old brass or sulfur or the jaundiced whites of a sick man's eyes. And they looked at me. They looked right at me, right into me, with an intelligence that had no business being in an animal's skull. They held my gaze for a long moment, those yellow eyes, and I felt something I'd never felt before in my 37 years of living in these hills. I felt like prey. The creature's lips pulled back further, and I heard a sound come from deep in its chest. Low, rumbling. It took me a moment to realize it was laughing. Then it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I stayed on that porch until dawn, my finger on the trigger, the shotgun growing heavier in my arms with each passing hour. When the sun finally crested the ridge and painted the hollow in shades of pink and gold, I walked out to that tulip poplar on legs that barely held me up. The marks were there. 5 deep gouges in the bark, arranged in a perfect arc where those impossible fingers had gripped the trunk. I touched them with trembling fingers, feeling the fresh sap weeping from the wounds in the wood, and I knew I hadn't imagined any of it. That was Wednesday morning. I called in sick again, and this time Patterson's voice on the other end of the line was sharp with irritation. "Cy, this is the second time this week. You got something catching? You need to see a doctor. You got something else going on. You need to tell me what it is." "Just a bug," I said. The words felt hollow in my mouth. "Be back Friday." There was a long pause, and when Patterson spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. "Everything okay out there? You don't sound like yourself." I almost told him. The words were right there on the tip of my tongue, ready to spill out in a flood of desperate confession. There's something in the woods, something that walks like a man but isn't a man, something that's been watching me, following me, coming a little closer every night. But I knew how it would sound. I knew what Patterson would think, what anyone would think. "I'm fine," I said, "just need some rest." After I hung up, I walked through the trailer, checking every window, every door, looking for signs of entry or disturbance. The place looked the same as it always did. My grandmother's lace curtains in the kitchen, my grandfather's hunting trophies on the wall, the worn spot on the carpet where Beaumont used to sleep before he started hiding under the bed. Everything in its place. Except the photograph. It had been on the mantel above the fake fireplace for as long as I could remember. A faded color snapshot of me and my grandmother taken the summer I turned 12, both of us squinting into the sun with the hollow spread out behind us in shades of green and gold. I must have looked at that photograph 10,000 times over the years, traced its edges with my fingers while I drank my morning coffee, remembered the way her hand had felt on my shoulder, steady and sure. The photograph was gone. I tore the trailer apart looking for it, checked behind the couch, under the beds, in every drawer and cabinet and box I could find. It wasn't there. It was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. Beaumont watched me from a spot under the bed, his brown eyes tracking my movements with that new wariness that had settled into him like a sickness. He wouldn't come out, not even when I knelt down and called his name in the soft voice I'd used when he was a puppy and afraid of thunderstorms. He just stared at me and whimpered, and I could see his whole body trembling. "I know, boy," I said, "I know." I thought about calling Denise. My sister had always been the sensible one, the one who went to college and got out of these hills, the one who'd built a real life for herself in Columbus with a husband and kids and a house with a lawn she paid someone else to mow. She'd believe me. She had to believe me. We were blood. But even as I reached for my phone, I knew I wouldn't make the call. What would I tell her? That something was stalking me in the hollow where we'd grown up, that it had broken into the trailer and stolen a photograph of our grandmother. She'd think I'd lost my mind. She'd worry. She'd probably call someone, a doctor, a therapist, maybe even the county sheriff. And they'd come out here and find nothing, because the thing in the woods didn't leave evidence that made sense to daylight thinking. No, I couldn't tell Denise. I couldn't tell anyone. I was alone in this. Truly alone. The rest of Wednesday passed in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I tried to sleep during the day, figuring whatever was out there was a creature of the night. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that snout, those teeth, those terrible yellow eyes that had looked at me with such knowing intelligence. I gave up around noon and spent the afternoon reinforcing the trailer's flimsy door with a 2x4 braced against the frame. It wouldn't stop anything determined to get in, but it made me feel slightly less helpless. At dusk, I loaded the shotgun again and took up my position on the porch. The temperature had dropped, and there was a bite in the air that spoke of the coming winter. I wrapped myself in my grandfather's old hunting jacket, the canvas one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and gun oil, and I waited. The silence came first. That unnatural quiet that had become a herald, a warning, a sign that something was changing in the hollow. The last cricket stopped singing. The wind died in the trees. Even my own breathing seemed too loud in that sudden vacuum of sound. Then I heard footsteps. They came from the east this time, from the direction of Dale's place, crunching through the fallen leaves with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. Not circling, not investigating, walking straight toward the trailer like something that knew exactly where it was going and had no reason to hide. I raised the shotgun. My hands were steadier now, the fear crystallizing into something harder and colder, something that felt almost like anger. 3 nights. 3 nights of being watched, being stalked, being toyed with like a mouse under a cat's paw. I was done being afraid. "Come on, then," I said into the darkness. My voice didn't shake. "You want something from me? Come and get it." The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against my eardrums like water. Then, from somewhere much closer than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet from the porch, maybe less, I heard a voice. It wasn't human. The sounds it made weren't shaped for human throats, weren't meant for human ears. But I understood it anyway, the way you understand a growl or a scream, the way you understand the message behind the noise even when the words make no sense. It said my name, Cyrus. 2 syllables dragged out and distorted like someone had recorded a human voice and slowed it down to half speed while raising the bass until it rumbled in your chest. But it was my name. It knew my name. Cyrus. Again, closer now, and I heard the creak of the porch steps under a weight that shouldn't have been there. One step, then another. Then silence. I couldn't move. The shotgun was frozen at my shoulder, my finger on the trigger, but I couldn't pull it. Couldn't do anything but sit there and listen to my name being spoken by something that had no business knowing it. Cyrus? The voice came from directly behind me now, from inside the trailer, and I realized with a sick lurch of terror that the thing had been on the porch the whole time. It had been behind me while I stared into the darkness, while I waited for it to come from the east, while I played the part of the brave man making his stand. It had been playing with me. All along, it had been playing with me. I spun around, bringing the shotgun up, and fired without aiming. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the porch, and the muzzle flash lit up the world in a split second of brilliant white light. I saw the screen door hanging open, the dark rectangle of the trailer's interior, the shape of something massive filling that doorway. Then the light was gone, and I was blind, my ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder filling my nostrils. I pumped another slug into the chamber and fired again and again and again until the gun clicked empty and I was just standing there pulling the trigger on nothing while my eyes streamed with tears from the smoke. When my vision cleared, the doorway was empty. The screen door swung gently in the night breeze, the mesh torn in several places where something had pushed through it. From inside the trailer, I heard Beaumont howling, a long, mournful sound that raised the hair on my arms and made me think of funerals. I didn't go inside to check on him. I couldn't. I stood on that porch with the empty shotgun in my hands and watched the darkness until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, I found the photograph. It was lying on the porch steps, right where the footsteps had sounded. The frame was intact, the glass uncracked, but the image itself had changed. My grandmother was still there, still squinting into the summer sun, but I wasn't beside her anymore. The space where I had stood was empty, blurred, like someone had taken an eraser to that part of the photograph and rubbed until there was nothing left but a vague smear of color. I picked it up with trembling fingers and held it close to my face, hoping I was wrong, hoping it was some trick of the light or damage from age. But no, I was gone from the photograph, erased or removed. And underneath the frame, scratched into the wood of the porch step with those terrible claws, were 3 words, "Coming for you." I packed a bag that morning, just the essentials, clothes, the shotgun, a box of slugs, my wallet and phone, and the keys to my truck. I left the rest of it, all of it, everything my grandmother had left me and everything I'd accumulated in 11 years of driving trucks and living alone in the hollow. I left Beaumont too, though it broke my heart to do it. The dog wouldn't come near me anymore, wouldn't respond to his name, just huddled under the bed and whimpered whenever I got close. He knew something I didn't, or maybe he knew the same thing and had simply accepted it. I was marked. I was being hunted. And nothing I did, nothing I could do, was going to change that. I drove to Dale's place first. He was out in his yard when I pulled up, working on the engine of his old Ford pickup, and he straightened up when he saw me with an expression that was equal parts concern and wariness. I must have looked half dead. 3 nights without sleep, clothes rumpled, eyes wild with a fear that I couldn't hide anymore. "Si, what the hell happened to you?" "I need you to take Beaumont," I said. The words came out flat, emotionless, like I was reading from a script. "I need you to take him and keep him and not ask me why." Dale wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward me, his eyes searching my face. "You're scaring me, Si. Talk to me. What's going on?" I wanted to tell him. God, I wanted to tell someone, anyone, just to have another human being know what I was facing. But I looked at Dale. Dale, who'd known me since childhood. Dale, who'd helped my grandmother and was probably the closest thing I had to a friend in this world, and I knew I couldn't put this on him. Couldn't drag him into whatever nightmare was unfolding in the hollow. "There's something in the woods," I said. "Something dangerous. I need to leave for a while, and I can't take Beaumont with me." Dale's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "Something in the woods? Like what, a bear? A mountain lion?" "Just take the dog, Dale, please. I'll call you when I figure things out." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the questions building behind his eyes. But Dale had always been good at reading people, good at knowing when to push and when to back off. And whatever he saw in my face must have told him this wasn't the time for questions. "All right," he said quietly. "You know where to find me when you're ready to talk." I drove away without looking back. In my rear-view mirror, I could see Dale standing in his yard, watching me go, and beyond him, the hills rising dark and ancient against the morning sky, the hollow where I'd grown up, where I'd thought I'd live out my days, was behind me now. I didn't know if I'd ever see it again. I made it to the on-ramp for Route 78 before I realized I had nowhere to go. Columbus? Denise would ask questions I couldn't answer. A motel? I'd burned through my savings in a week, and then what? I couldn't run forever, couldn't keep driving until the gas ran out and the money dried up, and I ended up sleeping in my truck on the side of some unfamiliar road. There had to be someone who would believe me, someone who would help, someone who knew about things like this, who had seen them before, who could tell me what I was dealing with and how to fight it. I pulled over at the rest stop near Caldwell and took out my phone. My hands were shaking again, but I managed to open the browser and type in a search. Dogman sightings, Ohio. The results came back in a flood. Hundreds of links, thousands of stories, forums and blogs and websites dedicated to something I'd never heard of before. Creature sightings across the state, going back decades. Descriptions that matched what I'd seen. Tall, bipedal, canine features, yellow eyes, hands instead of paws. Some of the accounts were obviously fake, the kind of attention-seeking nonsense you find on any corner of the internet. But others sounded like me. Scared, confused, desperate. I spent an hour reading through them, my coffee growing cold in the cup holder beside me, and with each story I felt my isolation ease just slightly. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. Other people had seen what I had seen, had felt what I was feeling, had stared into those yellow eyes and known the terror of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. But I also noticed something else. Something that made my blood run cold even as it confirmed my worst fears. None of the accounts ended with the creature leaving. None of them described a resolution, an escape, a moment when the nightmare finally stopped. The people who posted these stories were still running, still hiding, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. They'd been marked, just like me, and they'd never stopped being marked. The creature didn't quit. Once it chose you, it was yours forever. I sat in that rest stop parking lot and watched the sun climb higher in the sky, and I understood for the first time that this wasn't going to end. I could run to Columbus, to another state, to the other side of the country. It wouldn't matter. The thing in the woods had claimed me, had taken my photograph, and carved my fate into the boards of my grandmother's porch. And wherever I went, whatever I did, it would be waiting. I sat in that rest stop parking lot for another hour after the realization hit me. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the hills, and families pulled in and out around me. Minivans full of kids, couples stretching their legs on the way to somewhere better, truckers grabbing coffee and checking their phones. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the man in the old Chevy with the wild eyes and 3 days of stubble had seen something that would shatter every comfortable assumption they held about the world. I couldn't stay there forever. I knew that. But I also couldn't bring myself to move, to make a decision, to commit to any course of action when every option felt equally hopeless. Running hadn't worked. Waiting hadn't worked. Fighting hadn't worked. 4 slugs into the darkness and nothing to show for it but an empty shotgun and a torn screen door. My phone buzzed. Denise. I stared at her name on the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button, and I let it go to voicemail. What would I tell her? Hey sis, remember how you said I was spending too much time alone? Turns out there's something in the woods that erased me from a photograph and carved a threat into my porch. Can I crash on your couch for a few years while I wait for it to find me? She'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The phone buzzed again. Voicemail notification. I ignored it and pulled back onto Route 78, heading east toward Zanesville. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to move, to feel the road beneath my tires, to pretend for a few miles that I was still the man I'd been a month ago, a simple truck driver with a simple life and no knowledge of the things that lurked in the hollows between towns. The road was quiet. Mid-morning on a Tuesday, most of the heavy traffic was already where it needed to be. I passed mile marker 30, then 29, then 28. The hills rose around me, covered in the dying gold and brown of late October, and somewhere in those hills was the turnoff to Black Snake Hollow. I didn't take it. I couldn't go back there. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Mile marker 27. I remember the number because I saw it the moment everything changed. The creature emerged from the tree line 200 yards ahead. At first, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Daylight. Broad, clear, merciless daylight. The sun high enough that there were no shadows to hide in, no darkness to blame for tricks of perception. And yet there it was, stepping out of the brush and onto the highway shoulder with the casual confidence of something that had never been afraid of anything in its entire existence. I slowed the truck without meaning to, my foot lifting off the gas as my hands tightened on the wheel. The distance closed. 150 yards, 175, and with each passing second, more details resolved themselves into a picture that would never leave me. It stood upright, not hunched, not stooped, but fully erect, its shoulders thrown back like a man surveying his domain. But it was not a man. The body was covered in coarse gray-brown fur, matted in places, almost silver where the sun caught it along the chest and shoulders. The proportions were wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. Arms too long, hanging past where the knees should have been, and the torso too deep, too barrel-shaped, like it was built for power rather than speed. The legs. God, the legs. They bent backward at the knee, digitigrade like a dog's hind legs, but muscled like a linebacker's thighs. Each movement was fluid, controlled, a loping gait that covered ground with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't running. It didn't need to run. It simply walked, and each stride ate up 10 feet of road like the distance was nothing. At 50 yards, I saw the hands. Not paws. Hands. 5 fingers, each one tipped with claws that curved like fish hooks and gleamed yellow-white in the sunlight. The fingers flexed as it moved, opening and closing with what I can only describe as anticipation. And then it stopped. It stopped in the center of the highway and turned to face my truck, and I saw it completely for the first time. The head was wrong. Too long, stretched forward into a snout that was unmistakably canine, with lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were never meant to exist outside of nightmares. The ears stood erect, pointed, swiveling toward the sound of my engine like radar dishes homing in on a signal. The eyes were yellow, shot through with flecks of amber, and they locked onto my windshield with an intelligence that made every hair on my body stand at attention. 8 feet tall, maybe more, standing in the center of Route 78 at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. With the sun pouring down and the birds singing in the trees, and the whole world going about its business, completely unaware that something impossible had just stepped out of the shadows. It smiled. I know how that sounds. I know dogs don't smile, not really, that the expression we interpret as a smile is usually something else entirely: submission, nervousness, aggression. But this was a smile. The lips pulled back further, revealing more of those terrible teeth, and the eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that was almost human. It was amused. It had been hunting me for weeks, tormenting me, driving me from my home and my life and everything I'd ever known. And now it was standing in my path in broad daylight. And it was amused by my fear. Something older than thought screamed at me to run, to floor the gas and pray the truck was fast enough. But another part of me, the part that had spent 37 years in these hills, hunting and fishing and learning to trust my instincts, knew that running was exactly what it expected. Running was what prey did. Running was an invitation. I laid on the horn. The sound shattered the morning stillness, a blaring mechanical scream that echoed off the hills and sent birds exploding from the tree line. The creature's ears flattened against its skull, and for just a second I saw something like surprise flicker across its features. I hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring, and I aimed straight for the center of that impossible body. In my mirror, I could see the road behind me, empty and innocent, and ahead of me nothing but gray fur and yellow eyes and teeth that could tear through steel. 60 miles an hour. 70. The distance vanished in heartbeats, 50 yards, 30, 10, and the creature stood its ground, those yellow eyes locked on mine through the windshield. At the last possible second, it stepped aside. Not jumped, not dove, stepped. One fluid, casual movement like a matador letting the bull pass. I felt the displaced air rock the truck, caught a glimpse of those terrible hands reaching toward my window, close enough to touch if I'd rolled it down. And then it was behind me, and I was still accelerating, and the smell hit me through the vents. Copper. Musk. Something rotten underneath. Like meat left too long in the sun. The smell of death and predation. Of a hunter that had never known defeat. In my rear-view mirror, I could see it standing in the center of the road, watching me drive away. It made no move to follow. It didn't need to. The message was clear. It could catch me whenever it wanted. This wasn't about the chase anymore. This was about the fear. This was about watching me run. I didn't stop until I reached Zanesville. 40 miles of empty road. My hands locked on the wheel, my foot steady on the gas, my eyes darting to the rear view every few seconds to check if it was following. It wasn't. By the time I pulled into the Walmart parking lot, the same parking lot where I'd stopped to buy that trail camera a lifetime ago, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the truck in park. I sat there for 2 hours. People came and went around me, pushing carts full of groceries and diapers and Halloween decorations. Kids ran through the parking lot, laughing while their parents shouted at them to slow down. A woman in a red coat stopped to ask if I was okay, if I needed help, if she should call someone. I told her I was fine, just tired from a long drive, and she gave me a look that said she didn't believe me but wasn't going to push. When I finally trusted my legs to hold me, I went inside and bought coffee. Black, the biggest size they had. I drank it in the parking lot, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon, and I tried to make sense of what had happened. It had shown itself in daylight. After weeks of shadows and sounds and footprints in the dark, it had stepped out into the open and let me see it completely. Why? What had changed? The photograph. The words carved into my porch. Coming for you. It wasn't hunting anymore, it was playing, and the game was entering its final phase. I didn't report it. I know that probably sounds cowardly, but I want you to understand the position I was in. I'm a truck driver. My CDL is my livelihood, my identity, the only thing I've ever been good at. If I walked into a police station and told them I'd seen a werewolf on Route 78, what do you think would happen? Best case, they'd laugh me out of the building and make jokes about the crazy trucker who spent too much time alone. Worst case, they'd order a psych evaluation, flag my license, and I'd lose everything. And even if they believed me, which they wouldn't, what could they do? Send deputies into the hills with shotguns? Set up roadblocks? The thing I saw wasn't afraid of guns. It wasn't afraid of anything. Bullets might hurt it, might make it angry, but they wouldn't stop it. Nothing I had access to was going to stop it. So I stayed quiet. I kept the knowledge locked inside me like a tumor, growing and spreading and poisoning everything it touched. I drove to a motel on the outskirts of Columbus that night, paid cash for a room on the second floor, and lay awake until dawn watching the door. It didn't come for me that night, or the next, or the one after that. But I knew it would. The certainty of it was a weight I carried everywhere I went, a shadow that fell across every moment of relief and every attempt at normalcy. It wasn't done with me. It had let me go, had let me see its face and live to remember it, because the game wasn't over yet. I sold the trailer 2 weeks later. I couldn't go back there, couldn't face those woods or that porch or the room where Beaumont used to sleep at the foot of my bed. I called a real estate agent in Zanesville, told him I needed to liquidate fast and wasn't worried about getting top dollar. He probably thought I was running from creditors or an ex-wife, and I let him think whatever he wanted. He found a buyer within a month, some developer looking to build vacation cabins in the hollow. And I signed the papers without reading them and deposited the check and never looked back. I talked to Patterson, my supervisor at Consolidated Freight, and asked about the transfer to the Columbus Distribution Center. He was surprised. I'd always been vocal about my preference for rural routes, for the solitude of the open road, but he approved it without too many questions. I think he could tell something had changed in me, that the quiet, reliable driver he'd known for 11 years had been replaced by someone else entirely, someone who flinched at shadows and checked his mirrors too often and refused to drive after dark. I took a pay cut. Regional city halls paid less than the long-distance runs I'd built my career on, but I didn't care. Every mile of highway that didn't pass through forest, every route that kept me within sight of buildings and streetlights and other people was worth the lost income. I couldn't go back into those hills. I couldn't face the hollows and the ridges and the dark places where things like that creature made their home. I moved into an apartment complex in Westerville on the 4th floor of a building with security lights and no trees within 50 yards of the entrance. The rent was more than I'd paid for the trailer and my utilities combined, but the walls were concrete and the neighbors were loud and there was always someone around, day or night. I'd spent 11 years craving solitude. Now solitude was the last thing I wanted. Beaumont stayed with Dale. I called him a few days after I got settled in Columbus, asked how the dog was doing, and Dale's voice was careful when he answered. Beau was okay, he said. Eating well, getting along with the other dogs. But he wouldn't go near the tree line anymore. Wouldn't even look at it. Just sat on Dale's porch and stared at the woods like he was waiting for something. I told Dale he could keep him. I couldn't explain why, couldn't tell him what had happened or what I was afraid of. But I think he understood anyway. He'd grown up in the hollow too. His father and grandfather had spoken of unnamed things in the woods, stories passed down through generations that most people dismissed as folklore. Maybe Dale knew more than he let on. Maybe he'd seen something himself sometime in his life and had made the same choice I had, to stay quiet, to pretend, to lock the knowledge away where it couldn't hurt him. Take care of yourself, Si, he said before he hung up, and if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. I never called him back. Denise figured out that something was wrong, of course. She'd always been perceptive, even when we were kids. Always able to read me better than anyone else in the family. She came to visit my new apartment about a month after I moved, and I could see the concern in her eyes as she looked around at the bare walls and the minimal furniture and the blackout curtains I'd hung over every window. It's a nice place, she said carefully, close to work. That's why I picked it. Si. She hesitated, choosing her words. I talked to Dale. He said you left in a hurry and said you looked like you'd seen a ghost. I almost laughed at that. A ghost would have been easy. A ghost would have been explainable, categorizable, something the world had a framework for dealing with. What I'd seen had no framework. It existed outside the boundaries of everything we thought we knew about reality. I was ready for a change, I said. The hollow was getting to me, too quiet, too isolated. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face, in the way her lips pressed together and her eyes searched mine for the truth I was refusing to give her, but she didn't push. She hugged me instead, longer than usual, and told me I was always welcome in Columbus, that her kids missed their Uncle Si, that I should come for Thanksgiving. I said I would. I didn't. I became the uncle who makes excuses, the brother who never visits, The man who used to be close with his family and now keeps them at arm's length. Not because he doesn't love them, but because he's afraid of what he might bring with him. Every time I consider driving to Denise's house, I imagine that thing following me. Imagine those yellow eyes watching from the tree line as her kids play in the yard, and the fear freezes me in place. Better to stay away. Better to be the disappointing relative than the one who led a monster to their door. It's been 14 months since I saw the creature on Route 78. 14 months of jumping at shadows, of waking in the middle of the night certain that something is watching me through the window, of driving with my eyes fixed on the mirrors as much as the road ahead. I still work for Consolidated Freight, still drive the regional routes that keep me in the city, still collect my paycheck and pay my rent and go through the motions of a normal life. From the outside, I probably look like any other middle-aged trucker who made a lateral move for reasons nobody bothered to ask about. But I'm not normal. I haven't been normal since that morning in the hollow when I found those footprints beneath my window. I sleep with the lights on now, something I haven't done since I was 5 years old and afraid of the thing in my closet. I keep the shotgun under my bed loaded with slugs, even though I know it won't do any good. I check the locks 3 times before I go to sleep, and I check them again when I wake up at 2 a.m. with my heart pounding and the certainty that I heard something breathing outside my window. I never go out after dark. Never. If I'm running late on a delivery, I pull into a well-lit parking lot and wait until morning. If a friend invites me to dinner or a movie or anything that might keep me out past sunset, I make excuses. I don't drink anymore, not because I had a problem, but because I can't afford to be impaired. Can't afford to have my reactions slowed or my judgment clouded. I need to be ready. For what, I don't know. I tell myself I'm preparing for a confrontation, for the moment when it finally comes for me and I have to fight or die. But the truth is, I don't think fighting will make a difference. The thing I saw on Route 78 wasn't afraid of my truck. It wasn't afraid of anything. When it decides the game is over, when it gets tired of watching me run, there's nothing I'll be able to do to stop it. I still drive past Black Snake Hollow sometimes. Not often, but occasionally, when a route takes me out that direction and I don't have the energy to find an alternative. The trailer is gone now. The developer demolished it last spring, put up 2 vacation cabins in its place that rent for more per week than I made in a month. The tree line is the same, though. The hills are the same, and sometimes when I'm passing mile marker 27, I see something in my peripheral vision, a shape at the edge of the woods, tall and motionless, watching the traffic go by. I never slow down to get a better look. I just grip the wheel and keep my eyes on the road and tell myself it was a deer, a shadow, a trick of the light. I know it wasn't. I know what's waiting out there in the hollows, patient and eternal, an old thing that has always been there and always will be. But admitting that, acknowledging it, giving it power, feels like surrender. And I'm not ready to surrender yet. I've thought about going public, about telling my story to one of those podcasts or YouTube channels that collect accounts like mine, giving my testimony to the world and letting people believe what they want to believe. But what would be the point? The skeptics would call me a liar or a lunatic. The believers would want details I can't provide, explanations I don't have, proof that doesn't exist. And somewhere in the hills of southeastern Ohio, that creature would be listening, would know that I was talking about it, and maybe that would be enough to end the game once and for all. So I stay quiet. I keep my secrets. I live my half-life in a 4th-floor apartment with security lights and no trees. and I wait for something I can't name to decide my fate. Every night when I close my eyes, I see that smile, those yellow eyes, the casual mocking grace of its movement as it stepped aside and let my truck pass. It didn't kill me that day because it didn't want to, because the fear was sweeter than the flesh, because I was better as a broken, running thing than as another body in the woods. I know it's still out there, in the hollows, in the dark places, in the spaces between towns, where no one goes after sunset. I know it remembers me, just as I remember it. And I know, with a certainty that lives in my bones, that one day it will come for me. The game isn't over. It's just on pause. But here's the thing I've learned in 14 months of living with this knowledge, this fear, this weight that I can never set down. The world doesn't care about what I saw. The sun still rises. The bills still come due. People fall in love and have children and grow old and die without ever knowing that there are things in the darkness that shouldn't exist. Life goes on, indifferent to the impossible. And so do I. I get up every morning, I drive my routes, I call my sister on Sundays and make excuses for why I can't visit, why I can't come to Thanksgiving, why I've become this stranger. She barely recognizes I exist, I endure. I keep putting one foot in front of the other because the alternative is to stop, to give in, to let the fear swallow me whole. Some nights, when the apartment is too quiet and the walls feel like they're closing in, I think about Grandma Ruth, about the way she used to stand on the porch of the trailer and watch the sunset, her face calm and knowing. She lived in that hollow for 60 years. She must have known there was something in those woods, must have heard the stories, seen the signs, felt that same wrongness I felt in the weeks before the sighting. But she never ran. She just lived her life, raised her grandson, and died in her own bed with the woods pressing close outside her window. I don't know if that makes her brave or foolish. I don't know if I'm the coward for running or the smart one for surviving. I just know that I'm still here, still breathing, still waiting for whatever comes next. And maybe that's enough. Maybe survival isn't about winning or losing. Maybe it's just about lasting one more day, one more night, one more sunrise before the darkness finally catches up. I saw a dogman cross the highway in broad daylight. That's the truth. That's what happened. I can tell you every detail of its body, every feature of its terrible face, every second of the encounter that changed my life forever. But I can't tell you what it was. I can't tell you where it came from, or why it chose me, or what it wants. Some mysteries don't have answers. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I'm Cyrus Valewood. I drive trucks for a living, or I used to. I live in a fourth-floor apartment in Westerville, Ohio, and I haven't seen the inside of Black Snake Hollow in 14 months. My dog lives with my neighbor now. My sister thinks I've had a breakdown. My life, the one I built over 37 years of living in the hills I thought I knew, is gone. But I'm still here. That has to count for something. And every night before I close my eyes, I check the locks 3 times. I listen for footsteps that shouldn't be there. I watch the window for eyes reflecting back the glow of security lights. It let me go once. There's no reason to think it will let me go again. But until that night comes, until the game finally ends and the darkness catches up, I'll keep driving, keep moving, keep surviving. It's all I know how to do.